Dan, welcome to the podcast. It's going to be a very interesting hour. I'm really excited about this topic. We are going somewhere like way far. Well, I shouldn't say that. Kind of far away from what we usually talk about, but also the same. So we're going to talk about a lot about the metabolic health of dogs and the dog food industry and all of the things related to that today. And I'm sure there's tons of dog owners listening right now who are going to get a lot out of this hour. And we were talking a little bit before we started recording, like you're basically like me in the dog world. Like you are the metabolic, you know so much about metabolic health for dogs and the dog industry, the dog food industry. And I'm just really excited to have you here today because I think that a lot of people are going to get a lot out of this. So welcome and thanks for coming on.
You're welcome. The pleasure is mine. It's great to be here, and you're right. There is plenty to talk about. I would suspect, based on just like the same thing that you said, that there just aren't that many people doing this in the doggy world, that many of your listeners will not have heard a lot of this material before. But like you said, I would also bet that if they're very regular listeners of yours and they're conversant in a lot of these subjects with regard to human health, that their best guess on how they would manifest in the companion animal world is probably close to right. There's a lot that holds by analogy, but I'll give you all the nitty-gritty details so everybody can learn to be a better pet owner over the course of the next hour.
Yeah. And I would think even if people aren't pet owners, it's still going to be a lot of interesting information. Maybe you will get a pet at some point, or you can share it with a friend or family member and just make sure that those animals that are in our lives are taken well care of. So tell us how you got into this. I know you're a lawyer. Tell us how like you got so passionate. You're kind of like this issue just lights a fire under my behind. Like every time I go in the grocery store, I get worked up like, oh, I just can't believe what food we can put in the human body and it's not like a crime. So tell us how you got so passionate about the dog food industry, and not even just dogs, because I know you speak of
Sure.
all the companion animals you were alluding to.
Yeah, that's the term of art. I mean, I think I would say like emotionally, it went from like interest and sort of a benevolent vibe, like a kind of I want to be a good person vibe, to definitely to something that's closer to the way that it sounds like you see the modern like food ecosystem in the US now, which is a sense of righteous indignation, where I am motivated and I've become more and more obsessed with the relevant subject matter because there are bad people doing bad things that are causing harm on a wide scale, and they deserve a comeuppance. And that is part of what gets me out of bed in the morning, honestly.
Yeah.
But it started not like that, honestly. It started when, as you mentioned, I'm a lawyer. Yeah, I used to practice law. Now I use it, but I don't actively represent clients anymore. But once upon a time, I did. I was a young man. I got a dog. My first dog was like, I was raised with dogs. My mother loves them, and we always had them as a kid. But I didn't get my own until I was a herb yuppie in the city of Atlanta, working too much as a lawyer, and I got my first dog. He has since passed on. He's a Rottweiler, a big male Rottweiler that was like a quintessential example of the breed, which is to say, super intense and strong and protective instincts and needed daily exercise to be a polite member of society. And as a busy guy, I became very motivated to give him that exercise in as efficient and as like manageable a way as possible and as enjoyable a way as possible. And through the course of doing that, I started reading more about issues of exercise and physical activity and body composition with regard to dogs, which sounds super weird. But as you go into the world of exercise in dogs, you will quickly learn how big of a deal obesity is among dogs and cats, companion animals in the Western world. And I was kind of blown away by the commonality and the severity of the of obesity in these animals. And so the two main facts that I always tell people when I'm describing the extent of the obesity problem among companion animals are these. Number one, being moderately overweight, so not colossally obese where every person is like, oh my God, that poor animal. But something that with a trained eye, you would say that dog is overweight. Whereas if you weren't trained up and looking for it, you might not even recognize it. That kind of animal, that condition is worse for that animal than a lifetime of smoking is for a person. So if you smoke from the time you're 18 years old until the day you die, on average, your lifespan is going to be knocked back compared to with somebody that doesn't smoke. Being moderately overweight is worse for a dog's lifespan than that entire life of smoking is for a person. So a huge, huge, huge deal for them. But secondly, it's incredibly common. It's more than half the dogs in the country. So you know, I say this a lot too. I don't know your dogs. We've never met. I can see in the background of your video right now an image of one of them, but it's hard to see. It's a photo from a side angle, and I can't really see. But if I were playing the odds and if I were a betting person, I would bet that your dogs are overweight or obese because it's more than half the dogs. The next animal you see on the street, it is more likely that it is going to be a lifetime smoker than not. And those two facts kind of blew me away and really caught my attention and led me to like consider whether I needed to be doing this on something more than a personal hobby level.
Right. Well, we're glad that you did a deeper dive and that you discovered a lot of the things that we're going to be talking about, because it's just, it seems like the metabolic issues have skyrocketed in dogs and pets, just has this in the same way as they have with humans. And we're going to see so many similarities between the
Yeah.
two. And I'm happy to say my dogs aren't obese, but they get
I'm,
a ton. No, but I'm just saying, like, they get a ton of exercise. Like when you were talking about your Rottweiler, we have a 3-year-old sheepadoodle who's the same. Like, I mean, she's born to run. She's half sheepdog. If she doesn't get a run or walk in the morning, I mean, I can't. She follows me. Like, it's just,
yeah,
it's not a fun day for me
I
because
know. Yeah, they live
it's
for
like,
it in a way.
no, I'm like, she just bothers me all day. So, yeah, so let's just talk a little bit about the metabolic health of dogs. And I would be, I would kind of assume that it's like metabolic health issues, diabetes, being overweight, they're developing in a lot of the same manner as they are for humans. I mean, so we teach and we focus mostly on insulin resistance in this podcast and reversing insulin resistance, because by the time those high blood sugars come, I mean, you are a metabolic mess. And I would imagine that's the same for dogs. So I mean, what's the base root cause? Is it the insulin resistance and the blood sugars in dogs as well? That is really the main issue. I mean, that's why they're getting diabetes, but the weight issues is it all coming back to kind of, we know, like my listeners know, like the carbohydrates are the main issue. When you have type 2 diabetes as a human, you're not processing carbohydrates. And if you are, it's not efficient. You're developing insulin resistance. You're not utilizing energy. Is it the same in dogs? I would imagine so. And, and then going a step further than that, well, we should just start with there, and then we'll
Yeah,
talk about
break it down.
the
So
treatments, because I'm sure it's the same in dogs as it is for human. It's probably the exact opposite of what you should be doing.
yeah, that is right. And I'll take it even a step further that like some of the themes that I would try to emphasize when helping folks who already understand the nutritional science around modern metabolic issues in people and want to extend that knowledge to how they think about their pets too. One of the themes I would emphasize is that there's a great deal of similarity, that the nuts and bolts of how a dog takes food from breaks food into nutrients and absorbs nutrients and metabolizes nutrients and what that does within their body is much more similar to what happens with when people do the same thing than it is different. Not exactly the same. There are, of course, differences, but a lot. If you were to just assume that everything functions the same way, you'd get more right than wrong. The second theme that I'll emphasize is that the amount of scientific work that is taking place in the veterinary nutrition domain is dwarfed by the amount that's taking place in the human domain. The number of practicing veterinary nutritionists in the United States is minuscule. The number of academics who are actively performing experiments and writing up papers and moving the ball forward with regard to what we understand about canine and feline nutrition is tiny. The amount of money that is available to fund that kind of work is dwarfed by the NIH, for instance, doesn't devote its budget to studies aimed at improving the health of dogs and cats. They'll do animal models for human significance, but it's a completely different world. And so the amount of research is much smaller as well. And that's the second main theme I'll highlight. And that came to mind because you mentioned something that I take for granted, but is less well established in the scientific literature than I would like it to be. It's much less well established in the human world, which is like incidence rates and prevalence stuff is really uncommon. So it's like it's hard to track down a good number for like how many dogs have diabetes today versus 10 years ago. Like you can't find that kind of thing. You can find obesity and body composition stuff real easy to measure. It's commonly measured at every vet appointment, and so you can track that down real easily. And some other diseases, common fatal diseases, cancer incidence rates you can find. But like diabetes is kind of all anecdotal. And so you sort of like struggle to get something I've encountered in my life is a little bit of a struggle to develop the momentum that I think that problem deserves in the veterinary nutrition world, because it's a very real disease for dogs and even worse for cats. And it has what I think of as common sense solutions that are on the, like you said before, they are the exact opposite from the mainstream course of care. And so you have people that are stuck in a cycle of, oh my God, my dog has this problem. I'm doing what the vet is telling me to do, and I'm pouring money down the drain. And this horrible, my dog is in a rough shape and nothing is ever getting better. And it's purely a function of bad information.
Sure, I believe it. And when you say veterinary nutritionist, like I didn't even know that was a thing.
It
I've never
hardly is. It
heard of
hardly
it.
there are fewer than 100 board certified veterinary nutritionists in the United States. So
Wow.
there are only, I think the number right now is 32 accredited vet schools in the United States. Might be, it's right around there. And
Wow.
so like you think about that, you're talking about a class of a few hundred to maybe 1,000 people at the most there. And so there's something like 100,000 vets in the United States, but only 1 out of 1,000 of them is a board certified veterinary nutritionist. It's like there's not enough. There are a few reasons why, in my judgment, that is the case, but it's like there's not enough economics there to support a clinical practice that's focused entirely on that. It's just not the way that people think about how they feed their pets. Like I'm going to make a regular visit to the veterinary nutritionist part of our life. Like there are some people that might seek those people out for clinical help, but it's spotty and occasional. And so they all work in industry. They sometimes work in the academy as well, but like the freelance on the corner veterinary nutritionist is not a thing. And so, yeah, you have dual problems, of course, there, right? You have a lack of availability and expertise. And then the folks who are bona fide, legit experts are co-opted by industry in a way that's hugely, hugely damaging to companion animal health and well-being.
There's just so many similarities.
Oh,
Like
it's
same with
exactly very
the
similar.
medical field. Yeah, you go to your doctor, you have an issue, you go to the doctor, you just assume that whatever they tell you to do is in your best interest. And let's be clear, it's not like there's vets and doctors out there trying to make us sicker. I mean, it's just what they've been taught. And then, a lot of the recommendations are making you more ill. And I would imagine that's the same in the vet world. It's like they've been taught what they've been taught. Medical doctors get like hardly any nutrition education whatsoever, which is so much the base root cause of chronic disease. And so they don't know how to fix it. And yeah, it's mind boggling. But like you were alluding to, I'm sure it's so much harder in the animal world because of the lack of funding and the studies and let's face it, we're not gonna pour as much of our financial resources into a pet as we would a human. So yeah, it's just
That's
is
the
really
thing.
interesting.
It's a voiceless constituency. So you don't, dogs and cats obviously don't advocate for themselves. And so it
Right.
requires to like affect any kind of social or public health change, you need to communicate to the pet owners and rile them up that it's, which is possible, but just adds like a link to the chain. There are other unique things too, though. Unlike it, there are, of course, products that doctors sell, of course, prescription drugs. But the way that pet food is sold through veterinarians is somewhat different. The way that like the significance of the pet food brands on what veterinarians understand about nutrition, I would wager is a much more significant thing even than the way that doctors are misled about the utility of prescription drugs. And it's because of this. Prescription drugs in any individual case, you can mislead a sufficiently motivated big pharma company can pull the wool over a bunch of doctors' eyes, but it's limited to that one kind of domain. You've got to address diabetes, and then you've got plenty of other drugs that are relevant to other diseases. And it's like a case of misleading with regard to each one of these individual discrete topics because they're selling those products on a discrete basis. In the veterinary world, when you go to your veterinarian, there is a whole shelf of products being sold by essentially one, to a limited extent, two companies that are much more similar than they are different. They have very similar characteristics across the board. And so because they're all being sold, a veterinarian's like the extent to which their knowledge of nutrition is co-opted by industry is so complete that it's very hard to like see unless you're outside that. The number of veterinarians that I've met in my life who are able to go, this information that I've been taught has all been kind of constructed and put in front of me by industry. The extent to which that's the case is really hard to get. It's like you can convince people of it from the outside, but getting somebody to like see outside the fishbowl, as it were, is an incredibly difficult thing.
Right, because I would imagine even the most health conscious people with dogs or pets, they're not thinking about anything other than like kibble for the dog. I mean, it's just like, and these high-end brands, you would think, oh, well, they're using like real food or organics. Like I'm looking at a label and I'm like, oh, it's all real food. But let's talk about the macronutrient needs
Yeah.
of canines and felines because
Sure.
dogs are basically carnivores, as are cats. And just from me listening to you on other platforms, the carbohydrates in these these dog foods, cat foods is insane, really. Like it's
It's
just not
backbone.
lining up with what their actual needs are. So let's talk about the macronutrients, how they're broken down and really how they're not matching up with what they should be eating.
Yes, of course. So it is an incredible mismatch. The extent to which carbohydrate is the backbone of the modern pet food ecosystem and the importance of carbohydrate to legitimate nutritional functions in dogs and cats. So both dogs and cats do not have a nutritional requirement for carbohydrate. This is not a matter of mainstream versus fringe debate. This is something that, if they are pressed on the matter, any veterinarian in the world will admit just about. There are some folks who are just misinformed and wrong, but for the most part, that's not a matter of serious debate. They will admit to you that taking carbohydrate out of the diet of dogs and cats does absolutely nothing bad to the animal. If you take enough protein out of the diet, we know what will end up happening. There is like, the equivalent, like what happens during starvation is real, it's documented, and it's taught, and it's baked into the regulation of pet food in the US. In order to sell complete and balanced pet food in the US, it has to contain a certain protein content. If it's less than that, we know through the scientific record that bad things start to happen to your dog or cat. Same thing with fat. Same thing with the building blocks of those macros, right? The amino acids and the different kinds of fatty acids. Same with micronutrients, vitamins and minerals. All over, people have cared about dogs and cats for long enough that this independent scientific study of all these topics has taken place to one degree or another. And we know that an animal needs this much vitamin D or else this might happen. Carbohydrate is left off the table there, and rightly so. Nothing bad has ever been shown to happen if you remove carbohydrate from canine and feline diet. And that might seem like common sense to any one of your listeners, because like you alluded to, these animals obviously descended from wild carnivores that ate 0.0% carbohydrate in their diet. Excuse my St. Bernard Wayne, who's can be noisy. You may just heard that in the background. That was just the sound of his jowls flopping, which happens constantly throughout the day, and it's so loud that it'll disrupt an interview. Yeah, so I published a book in 2016 that's about these topics generally. And the first chapter is my experience going to Yellowstone National Park and living with the biologists at the Yellowstone Wolf Project, which is like the premier place in the United States for the study of wolves in the wild. And they'll be the first ones to tell you that a wolf throughout hundreds of millions of generations eats 0.0% carbohydrate, none of their diet. And dogs and wolves enjoyed the same lineage for 99.9% of their evolution as canine species. They split off very recently, and during that split, dogs have evolved the ability to digest carbohydrate effectively. Wolves literally can't do it. So over the course of developing what they need nutritionally and these like finely balanced forces of evolution, the wolves have consumed zero carbohydrate. So it's clearly not something that's like a major part of shaping who they are. And yeah, dogs don't need it. Cats don't need it. Same, all this sort of applies in the same kind of way. However, by far, the most common nutrient in the modern pet food ecosystem is carbohydrate. So if you, if I'm generalizing, in a garden variety kibble, and even, you can talk about it more broadly than that. You can say kibble products with a number of exceptions that's so small that you can count it on one hand is going to have at least 30% carbohydrate and very likely 50 to 60% carbohydrate. So not just is it the most common nutrition source of calories in the modern pet food ecosystem, it's the majority. So it's not just like it's a pure, simple majority where most of the calories that the animals take in these days come from carbohydrate. So you have a huge mismatch there. To say, we've not talked about the nasty things that carbohydrates do to dogs and cats. That mismatch alone should give everybody pause, right? Like there's something that's very worrying about that. When you change something so fundamental, so hugely about an animal's diet, like you would think that would set off alarm bells in a huge way. It sort of hasn't in the modern veterinary curriculum.
Yeah, and humans don't need carbohydrates either. And people like to debate when you say that, but it's like physiologically you don't. I mean, I'm not saying that like I don't eat any carbohydrates because I do. It's not the majority of my intake like it is most Americans, but you don't need them. I mean, you can convert other, protein to carbs and whatever it is. But I mean, dogs aren't humans, and they really don't need the carbohydrates. So when we're
Yeah.
looking at like like a or the nutrition facts, it's going to be different for dogs, for pet food, obviously, than human food. Is it just the ingredients that are listed? Can you get a percentage of the macronutrients that, because 30% to 50, I mean, we're talking 50 to 60% carbohydrates for dogs. That is insanity. I mean, we know it creates obesity in humans, especially if they're processed. And honestly, it's like sometimes you look at the ingredients in dog food and it's not lining up with what they should eat, but it's like sometimes the ingredients look better than it's in human food. But
This is one of
are
my
you
favorite.
looking
This is my favorite thing to talk about in the
percentage?
whole. There's this weird world that I occupy, which is like legal, regulatory,
Yeah.
science, academy, clinical practice, industry, all that stuff. And this is my favorite area, the area concerning the regulation of the labeling of pet food in the United States. I might be on a list of people. I don't know how many other people are on that list that would say that. Is not many people. Most people are much cooler. However, it is my favorite because it is absolutely mind blowing. I've said so many of the facts that I've like given you already today so many times that they sort of lose their eye-popping like quality on me. Like I've been there so much, but I know that they do hit people over the head when you hear half the dogs in the country have obesity. But the ones concerning the labeling of pet food are worse. So to answer your question directly, how do I know how much carbohydrate is in my pet food? The answer is you will not be told it on the label. There is a nutrition facts box, a quantitative nutritional information box that's required on all pet food that's sold in the United States. And it is, by analogy, similar enough to the US, to the FDA's nutrition facts panel that you find on your, can of Coke. But it does not include a line item for carbohydrate. And it's originally, when you trace it back, the reason for that made sense. And it's the one we already highlighted. They don't have a nutritional need for carbohydrate. So when people only thought about animals as we need to feed them in a way that keeps them alive, act like effectively, it made sense. We don't have to tell them how much carbohydrate is in there, because if they don't feed carbohydrate, the animal's going to be just fine. But as our relationship with animals evolved and they became what they are today, members of the family, are how we were thinking about matters of nutrition changed too. You don't think about just, is this food gonna keep my dog alive today? It's like, I want to optimize the animal's health. I want to minimize its chronic disease risk. And in that world, carbohydrate is hugely important, but it's not even on the label. And so, yeah, that alone is kind of mind-blowing. But it's worse than that, because I would say that a great number of US dog owners think about their animals' needs nutritionally pretty similarly to how you articulated it a minute ago, which is like, I know that these guys are descended from animals that were carnivores. And so I know on some level, without being familiar with the actual science in the particular, I don't know who wrote the studies and whatever, but like, they should mostly eat meat. And that means they should mostly avoid carbohydrate. And so I'm going to sort of take that philosophy into the pet store with me when I go to pick out what food I'm going to feed my dog. And you get there and maybe you notice it or maybe you don't, but there's no carbohydrate information on the label. Okay, so it's not there. What am I going to do? How am I going to make the right choice given what I understand and the fact that the carbohydrate isn't on there? Well, I'm going to look at the ingredient list, like you said, and I'm going to look for one where meat-based ingredients are at the top of the list, and I'm going to infer that that's going to be a low carbohydrate thing. Okay, good. I'm going to look for, well, if I see a wolf on the label and it's ancestral diet, and it's the image on the label is wolves eating an elk or something like that, that's a good indicator. Well, it's grain-free. That's a good indicator. That sounds like low carb. All of those things have evolved as loopholes to help people, to persuade people that the product that they're choosing is low in carbohydrate content when actually it isn't, because none of them deal with that subject directly. Like grain-free, for instance, is a very popular sector of the industry, but it's no different as a matter of carbohydrate. There's no like generalized lower carbohydrate content in those diets than there are non-grain-free diets. They just use a different source of carbohydrate. They use potato instead of corn, which is not a grain and therefore is grain-free, but it's just as much carbohydrate. And similar things can be said about ingredient lists, the imagery that's used, the language that's used. It's all an elaborate game, or elaborate trick, excuse me, that's designed to make people feel this is a low carby thing for my dog, when in reality it's not.
Yeah, and
It's
as you sit there and say that, so like me being as educated about metabolic health as I am, those are the things I would look for when I was looking for dog food. I'm like, I know they shouldn't be eating grains. I know they shouldn't be eating gluten. Like, look what it does to humans. So I would be very careful to look for grain-free and to look for like whole ingredients, and that they're mostly, like the first couple were at least meat. But yeah, then you see the rice and the oatmeal and the pea. And it's like, okay, dogs aren't supposed to be eating that. But as an educated consumer, you think you're doing, I mean, this is the same with food labeling in, for humans. It's like they'll slap everything on there
yeah.
just to get you to buy it. Whole grain, no dyes, or, gluten free, but it's still all processed garbage. So I mean, I've even been pulled into that, and you think you're doing the best that you can, but Given your options that you have, there really isn't a great option. So I think that's where at least with, human foods, you can always have an option that, in most circumstances anyway, that humans should be consuming. But it's like with dog food, it's like you go in even like a higher end, like I get our dog food from our daycare, like where I take our dogs for daycare. I don't get it from like a big box store, and you just assume, well, these are the better foods that are available, but probably they're maybe just a smidge better
And
than
they're much
than
more
that.
similar than they are different.
Yeah, yeah.
And a big part of it is like in the human, when people talk about what kind of diet they ought to eat, often they're talking about what they ought to be talking about, which is nutritional content, macros and micros. And if they're not talking about it in those terms, they're talking about it in terms that generalize from them. Maybe we're talking about types of food and we're saying things like whole foods, fruits and vegetables, meat products, but we're talking about those largely because we can generalize about the nutritional contents of those things. We know meat is zero carbohydrate, generally speaking, zero carbohydrate, so we can make inferences about it. In the world of, it doesn't matter if you are somebody who's getting their very first dog and is going to Walmart to buy the food, or if you are the most reputable veterinary nutritionist in the United States today. You are not talking about that. That is not a part of the discourse. The frame is completely different. Macros is not how it's discussed. What it's discussed is in terms of, is this a reputable brand? How is this made? Is it made through the what's called extrusion processing, which is used to make kibble, or is it freeze dried? It's like, where was it manufactured? Was it manufactured in the United States or somewhere outside the United States? But the issues that move the needle and the issues that are the basis of the scientific, like the science work that's actually done, are matters of nutritional content. And it's just not a part of the conversation. And it's like so fundamentally the cause of the problems, the public health versions of the problems that we see in companion animals is that one thing that like you got to react to what's out there when you go into the pet store to get a pet food store to pick a product for your dogs. You got to react to what's on the label and what the pet store owner is talking about, what your veterinarian's conversing about, and that stuff is just not relevant to the
Right.
nutritional conversation. And so you have what we have today, which is just like absolutely horrible public health.
Yeah, and you're right. It's like those are the things I'm looking for. Is it made in the USA? Is it like the ingredient list? So it's so true. And like I said, it's like I'm an educated consumer in the human, with the human food,
Yeah,
but
yeah, exactly.
with dogs, it's just a whole and pets, it's just a whole different story. So what do you think the motivators are behind the higher carb intake? I mean, I think it can be somewhat obvious. It's
Yeah,
cheap. I mean,
yeah.
it can be a good filler, but I think maybe this might be wrong of me to assume, but I would think, there's just a huge plant-based movement among the human foods too. Like, oh, like we should be vegan. We should have more plant-based. We should have mealless Mondays. So do you think some of that is coming into play? It's like, it should be obvious that dogs aren't humans and their diets aren't the same as us, but maybe you have, that might be a thought process behind some people's, you know, picking out a certain food for their animal is just like, well, maybe a plant-based movement is better for my dog. Like, what are the primary motivators behind why are we putting carbohydrates in dog food at all?
So what you're describing, in my judgment at least, is out there. You can find products that are being marketed for people that approach it with that perspective. There are brands that are like, we are a vegan, maybe I'll misquote it, but like no animal product
Yeah.
in this type dog food. They have historically at least struggled because they have to overcome this common perception that is accurate that people have that these animals descended from other animals that ate only meat. And so it feels pretty weird to change that, literally turn it on its head. But it is still there. And, the folks that are out there doing that are motivated by any cluster of things, won't, kind of judge them. As to the broader question of why carbohydrate is so central to the modern pet food ecosystem, the story goes something like this. They were um, carbohydrate, number one, is, like you said, very inexpensive. So the extent to which it's inexpensive is kind of mind-blowing, though. So like a calorie of the kinds of carbohydrate ingredients that are used in pet food most commonly is roughly 1/10 the cost of a calorie of the meat-based protein that is typically used in pet food. So if you are a producer, and all else being equal, let's say nutritionally for a second, let's put ourselves in a fantasy world where all this nutritional content impacts the animals the same ways. Yeah, you're going to use a lot of carbohydrate because it's way cheaper for you to produce. And that makes it better for the consumer as well, right? All else being equal, I'd rather feed something that is less expensive. And the pet food industry in the US grew up around that reality largely before the kinds of the studies and, more importantly, the cultural movements that helped people understand at a wide to a significant extent that that was a problem. And so by the time people came to understand that they're, people like me could read the scientific record and go, wait a second, this is bad. Carbohydrate is bad for these animals. By that point, the industry had already grown up. And it's like there were billion-dollar pet food brands, and every one of their products was 50% carbohydrate. And so, like, what do you do when you can't just make an incremental change to your product line? You have every one of your customers is fixated on, like, there are pet foods in the US today that cost a range of different prices, right? We know there are inexpensive ones and more expensive ones. But, let's be clear, none of them are expensive. They're insanely inexpensive. Like a $100 bag might feel like mind blowing, but if you work out to like the per day cost, if you were to just switch your dog onto McDonald's fries, you would, triple your per day expense. They're very inexpensive. And so if you were to try, and I know this because I founded a company that does this. If you try to make kibble with a lot of animal protein and a lot of animal ingredients and as little carbohydrate as possible, it changes your economics hugely to the point that you can't sell product. It's not like it eats your margin. You can't sell the product, period. It costs you more to make than you're pricing it. And so how else can you prop up the illusion that people should continue doing what they're doing is kind of where the industry is right now. And so you have these weird regulations, you have people denying the science, you have attempts to mislead people about what the science says, because it's an existential issue for these brands. You know what I mean? It's like there's no way the cigarette industry, when the Surgeon General's report on the relationship between lung cancer and smoking comes out, they don't have ways to react to that and preserve the core business other than deny and obfuscation. It's not like they all just said, well, we have nicotine replacement too, so just switch there and you'll be good to go. It's like they have to discredit that and work around the entire issue. And that's where the pet food industry is, because like carbohydrate is as central to these major products as tobacco is to a cigarette.
Sure. I was talking with my 3 kids. They're 20, 18, and 15. My 2 college kiddos are home on break right now. And I was talking about that. I'm like, okay, so we buy like a 40-pound bag of dog food pretty much every month for our 2 dogs. And it's like $80. And that's definitely on the high end of dog. But I'm like, there's no way I could feed 2 of you kids for
Yeah,
look at
exactly.
my boys, they're 18 and 15. I'm like, you guys eat $80 worth of food every like 2 or 3 days. There's no way. So yeah, I mean, I think for consumers looking for, like even we said, like the ones that are spending more on the dog food or their pets, it's still like comparatively, it's crazy cheap when you think about it.
Yeah,
And
but it's hard to think about it. It's like
yeah,
you're in a world where we've all gotten anchored to certain expectations around what pet food costs and what expensive pet food looks like and what less expensive looks like. And so getting people to go, well, wait a second, this is all just hugely inexpensive. What would this look like if I just fed my dog chicken McNuggets every day? Oh, it
yeah.
would be 5 times the cost of this incredibly fancy looking free range, grain-free kibble. Like, it's an eye opener.
It really is. So you mentioned 50% of dogs, and I think even more cats are overweight? Like, what are the first steps for dog owners? Because dog owners, I mean, overweight people don't want to be overweight. They don't want their dogs to be overweight. It's like I mentioned before we started recording, we have a dog park really close to our house. And sometimes you go and those dogs can barely run around the dog park because they are so overweight. So where do people start with that? Because you can't rely on, the food that's available. Well, what do we do?
So there are, I guess the way that I see the issue of obesity, both in dogs and cats and in people, is that you can't make them. There are a lot of different ways to lose body fat if the conditions are just right. Like I'm somebody that wrote a book about why carbs are bad and founded a company that's built on the premise that carbs are bad. I eat carbohydrate, but like I do ultra marathon. Like I'm a crazy active person. I do a lot of it. And between those two things, I can manage a happy medium and not get overweight. And so there are, as you know, like lots of ways to take fat off of an animal. You can't make them obese without carbohydrate, though. If you
Yeah.
don't put carbohydrate in, there's only one fundamental cause of it. And it's like the common framing of the problem of obesity as being one of calories in and calories out implies like the fact that that's wrong is can be expressed as that necessary thing too. You cannot make a dog or cat obese without carbohydrate. It doesn't, all else, you can take everything else off the table. It can't happen unless that or laboratory conditions. So, one of the ways, the most organic, I would say, way to help your dog ensure that its body stays in the right healthy body composition is to take the carbohydrate out of the diet. And you can do that. And there are a cluster of different ways to do it in the modern pet food ecosystem. But that's the first thing. There are other ways. They are more laborious. They're going to involve things like your physical activity level. Can you take your dog out for a jog with you every day? Or your willpower. Can I make sure that my dog is not going to guilt me into giving it any more treats at a certain part of the day? There are definitely other ways to help the animal stay lean, but there's only one like surefire way to make it overweight, and that's to put carbohydrate into the diet. You can't make it happen without that.
Yeah, and if you go to the vet and you get your dog weighed and they say your dog should really lose some weight, what are they going to tell you? They're going to tell you, "Oh, get the low cal or the
The,
overweight dog food or whatever it is." And I'm sure the macronutrients aren't much different in that, but I know like if a dog has diabetes, they're still getting high, high carbohydrate foods.
most common food prescribed to a dog that shows up at their vet's office and the vet diagnoses diabetes, the standard of care is feed it this product, Hill's Metabolic WD formula, 40% digestible carbohydrate.
Oh my goodness. Yeah, that's just a crime.
Mind blowing. It's
It
mind blowing. Obesity, the
ah,
scientific record when it comes to obesity in dogs and cats, you can just about squint and have real people that are educated about it, acting in good faith, debate the cause. You could just about get away with like making an argument that no, carbohydrate isn't really the root of the problem. It's there, you're going to get blown out of the water by somebody that knows this stuff seriously. Like there have just been so many studies performed that show that like carbohydrate is more fattening for dogs than other nutrients. But you can just about get there. And so I'm like a little sympathetic to when a dog shows up at the vet, it's overweight, the vet cares about the obesity, wants to help solve it, recommends a food that is still high in carbohydrate content, but lower in calories, lower in protein. The animal is going to lose weight, it's going to eat fewer calories, etc. Diabetes, I have zero sympathy. It's like if you graduate from veterinary school, you know that diabetes is a disease of being unable to process carbohydrate. You know that. If you don't know that, that's professional negligence. You can't, there's no way to square the circle and say, well, yeah, but it should still eat a diet that's 40% the thing it can't do. That is not acceptable. But it's the norm. And so while I have a lot of sympathy for both pet owners and vets, like it's a tough information environment where very wealthy, very motivated parties have deliberately tried to mislead you. I don't have sympathy on that issue. That is, to me, is you got to own that. If you're a vet and you're telling a dog owner they should feed their diabetic dog something with 40% carbohydrate, you're making a problem. You're harming that animal.
Yeah, and it's the same for diabetic humans. I mean, you're basically shuttled off to the diabetic, the diabetic educator, the dietitian, and you're told to eat carbohydrates all day long and just dose your insulin in response to the carbohydrate that you eat. And if your blood sugar goes up, you just take more insulin. It's like, really? Like, we just don't eat a lot of carbohydrate. Instead, it's mind blowing. Like you would think, okay, the base root cause of these issues isn't really hard. And when you tell a human who's overweight, I always say, like, if you take away sugar, alcohol, grains, and processed food, you probably won't have, eventually, you're not going to have a weight issue. Like it's going to resolve itself. But they get really uptight about that a lot of times. I mean, you have people who are going to do it, but a dog's probably like, yes, like, like
Yeah,
I want to eat protein and fat. I don't want these carbohydrates.
and even if not, they don't get to choose. You know what I'm saying? Like
Right. They're going to
that's the
eat
thing. It's like
whatever.
what makes it hard for me is like I have to exert willpower. I have to drive by the ice cream parlor and say no. I have to drive by the McDonald's and turn off the delicious scent. My dog doesn't have that issue. There's no willpower necessary. I choose. The person chooses. And so it like compounds how absolutely absurd it is. You can't, I'm sure you've heard a million times what practitioners, clinicians who are poo-pooing the idea that carbohydrate is bad for you will often say, well, it's unsustainable. You just can't do it to live on permanently on a diet without carbohydrate. It's too hard. It's unsustainable. Everybody fails. That is not an argument that can hold water in the dog and cat world. It's not a thing. So they don't even have that. And still they try to defend it. It's just, you can only say mind blowing like so many
Right.
ways, but it is. It's mind
Right.
blowing.
When I'm educating humans, I mean, I'm asking them to go from 300 to 400 grams of carbohydrate every day to under 100. It's not like I'm saying, okay, you can
Never.
only have 20. It's like this is sustainable if you just, make some alterations. So, okay, so what do we do as consumers if we want to feed our pets better? I mean, are there a couple of options, or is it better to do it at home? Like, how do we go about if we, like, I'm thinking, I'm willing to invest some time into this and actually look at changing their food or even just doing it half of the time if that's feasible.
Yep. So kind of three buckets that you can consider. For me, the gold standard is to feed a all meat, raw, commercially sold, complete and balanced pet food product. If money is no option, convenience is no option, no issue,
Yeah.
then that's what you should choose. Go into the pet store, you go to the freezer section. They also sell some in freeze dried way. You'll look at the label, you'll try to determine that this is really something that has zero carbohydrate and is all meat products, and you're going to go with that. I think that is a better choice than making something similar at home for a pretty simple reason, which is that there are very real health problems that can arise in cases of like micronutrient imbalance. And you might screw that up doing stuff at home. It's not like you're always going to, I think the issue is overplayed in a lot of domains that like more often than not, the types of meat products that you feed to your animal at home are probably going to be just fine in terms of like deficiency diseases and micronutrients, but it's a live issue. And so if you're going to do that, if you're what I think of as a less good option, trying to do it at home, you can consult. You can find them if you do just enough homework, veterinary nutritionists who will help you build a diet that is going to address the things that you want. I would not encourage your listeners to defer to them in what is healthy and just say something like, give me the healthy diet. But if you give them the parameters, they can help you get there in a way that avoids deficiency diseases. And then the third option is the one that my company does not make raw diets. I think that's the gold standard because it's the closest to what they've evolved to need. But it is expensive. It's like we make kibble it is less than 5% digestible carbohydrates. So it's like 90% less than the other very expensive, nice brands. Very different. But if you can afford to feed an all meat diet and you can deal with sanitizing the bowl, you're dealing with raw meats then, and see there's some of that kind of stuff, but that's better if you can do that. If not, I'd humbly suggest that our product, Ketona, is by far the best kibble option that you are going to find because there's just nothing else that's remotely close to it in terms of carbohydrate content. It is pricier than most, but not all other kibbles. It's relatively pricey as kibbles go, but it's much less expensive than raw diets. And so, like you mentioned before, that you said when we were getting to know each other at the beginning of this, that you have two big dogs. And I tried to emphasize to you that that's a matter of perspective because your two doodle mixes are in this 50 to 70 pound range. Without knowing your financial circumstances, it might be doable to do all meat raw, but it's like 5 times as much as feeding a fancy kibble. I can tell you though, for my household, where the framing on what constitutes a big dog is somewhat different because we have a 170-pound St. Bernard, that it's not doable. You know what I mean? Like the difference, if you have a tiny dog between fancy kibble and raw, might be the difference between 30 cents a day and $1 a day. For us, it's the difference between like, $5 a day and $30 a day, and it's just a non-starter. And so those are the parameters to use, and you can make good choices from there. I definitely encourage your listeners to focus on macros as opposed to qualitative statements about things like grain-free or missing whatever ingredient, and where it's made and what brand made it, that kind of stuff.
Yeah. And the dogs are so different. Like our younger sheepadoodle eats like 4 cups of food every day, has to eat at the same time, like kicking her bowl around if you're like 5 or 10 minutes off of mealtime, where our golden doodle's just like, I swear she fasts for 2, 3 days sometimes. Like her food's always there, but she doesn't care if she eats it or not. Like they're just so different. And she eats maybe a little bit more than half of our other. I mean, she's older, but she's never been so food driven as that sheepadoodle. So I'm curious to
Oh,
see
she's
like
the one
there's
you said?
differences, which I'm sorry, what?
I'm sorry, I talk over people sometimes. That was my fault. You said she's the older one though, the pickier or the less like
Yeah,
obsessive
yeah,
one. But
yeah.
she's a
She's
dog girl,
older, but she's always been like that. She's 12. And
40
I mean,
dogs.
obviously our 3-year-old dog is a lot more active, but she's always been very food driven also.
It's the competition. It's like that's my, again, anecdotal, is like solo dogs in households often develop that kind of like, why do I have to eat this fast? And then it just sticks. Whereas like multiple dog households, I've seen it in my own life multiple times, like they learn the behavior of like, I gotta get this all
Yeah.
down. We haven't even talked on, I know this is your show is largely focused about on fasting. We could talk very interesting stuff about how often wolves eat in the wild, because it's like it's not 2 or 3 days, it's 2 or 3 weeks. They
Oh,
eat,
wow.
yeah, they eat like 20% of their body weight in one time and then don't eat again for 10 days. And so that type of rhythm and that type of common, like of everyday fasting, is very common in the evolutionary heritage of dogs. It's very uncommon these days where we feed them, twice a day, every day.
Yeah, and I would imagine if you are cutting the carbohydrates out and you're upping the protein just like with humans. I mean, it's so much more satiating. Like I eat twice a day when I'm protein centric around my meals. I don't think about food for 5, 6 hours, where when I was eating a lot of carbohydrates that were healthy whole grains and like they were whole foods, but I was just eating way more carbohydrates from the time I got up until dinner time, and I wasn't doing any intermittent fasting. I was thinking about food all the time. I was hungry all the time. And of course you can't ask the dog, like, are you thinking about food right now? But I would imagine like changing that macronutrient profile, I would think they wouldn't eat quite as much food either.
Yeah, I'd be shocked if it hurt. You know what I mean? I mean, like one of the lines of thinking that I find persuasive regarding evolution is like the rate of obesity in dogs and cats is over 50%. The ratio of obesity in wild gray wolves that are so similar to dogs genetically that they can interbreed, like they're two different
Yeah.
species, but they can produce offspring, is 0.0. And that's despite the fact that they eat once every couple weeks, a 20-pound meal and they just happen to be getting it exactly right. It's like, no, there are internal homeostatic mechanisms that keep you eating relatively the right amount unless you interpose something that makes it all go haywire, like carbohydrate. And so, yeah, I would probably imagine it's the same. I'm not sure we'll ever know, but
Yeah.
uh, it probably doesn't hurt. Probably doesn't hurt.
Yeah. As much as I love eating, it would be kind of cool to just eat once a week and not think about it again for that many days and just be like, oh, I'm good. I'm good for a week. I don't have to do that. No more grocery shopping. Especially when you have kids, like let's just eat once a
Oh
week.
yeah, yeah, that would definitely help. For me, it's always like when I'm being really good about not eating carbohydrate and being very like healthful in my dietary choices, the place I always super notice it is first thing in the morning. Like if I'm eating really good keto, a lot of protein, very little carbohydrate, I don't start to feel that rumbly stomach hunger in the morning feeling. I just eat at some point in the morning. If I'm not doing that and I'm eating a typical standard American diet, I always like wake up, have a cup of coffee, and then my stomach starts rumbling, and it's so tangible and noticeable. That's like that's how, that's my particular homeostatic, like, aha.
Yeah. Yep, I noticed the same thing. Like if I'm gone over the weekend or haven't done my usual, usually it's that next day that I'm feeling, or if I'm sleep deprived like that, that is game changing for me
Yeah,
too.
sleep deprived does it for me too. That is absolutely a thing for me that I've become uh more likely to eat poorly after a bad night's sleep, 100%.
Yep. Body's looking for some quick energy, that's for sure. Well, this has been a fascinating topic. I am glad that there is an option for kibble through your company. So tell us where to find you. So the book Dogs, Dog Food, and Dogma is available on Amazon, I believe. And then you also have a podcast, correct? And tell us where
Yeah.
we.
So our podcast is called Feed Your Dog Facts. It is about generally matters of veterinary nutrition, but we talk about the kinds of things we talked about on this show, like being a shopper, understanding the how to contextualize your vet's recommendations, where they come from, that kind of stuff. We talk about this study says this type stuff a lot too. We'd love it if anybody that's into this kind of stuff tuned in and gave us feedback on how you think we're doing. And then, yeah, my company is called KetoNatural Pet Foods. And it's not that hard to find. If you type keto dog food, you'll find it, and you actually won't find too many others. And it's like the whole reason we chose the keto prefix and sort of locked it up in the doggy world is like not only are you not required to tell consumers how much carbohydrate is in your product, they also, similar motivation, I would submit, have an active prohibition on using the expression low carbohydrate. So I can't sell low carbohydrate dog food without breaking the law. You cannot use that expression or you are breaking the law. And so they left a loophole for keto. And so we embraced it. And so if you look for keto dog food, you will find KetoNatural Pet Foods, which is my company. And we sell it through all the major online retailers, Chewy and the rest. And yeah, check us out. We have really robust guarantees. Something I probably should highlight is like if you are a little unsure, this feels compelling, persuasive, want to give it a try, not sure, we offer like the best guarantee in the business where it's like for any reason, if your dog doesn't like it, you will get all of your money back. So that's something to consider.
That's great. Yeah, all of those nutrition fact labeling loopholes that usually aren't for the good of us are just crazy. So thank you for coming on and sharing all of your knowledge. I mean, this has been a fascinating topic. Like I said, even if you're not a pet owner, I think it's fascinating and disturbing, and things need to change. So hopefully people will be sharing the crap out of this podcast and getting some more exposure. And we thank you for all the work you're doing because it's like I know you probably feel the same way. Like sometimes in this space, I'm like, am I like making any headway with anything? You're just up against so much dogma, so just the industries, and you just feel like you're just this one little person. But hey, it starts with the consumer and their choices and going from there.
And I'll leave, or maybe this is an appropriate place to end the conversation, which, by the way, I really enjoyed too. This is always, so, I mean, like, this was a great conversation from my perspective. I spent some time working with Gary Taubes when I was writing my book, and something that Gary always said when I would lament how sometimes it feels like the obstacles and the you're up against too much, and am I just like screaming into the void, or how am I ever going to make headway? It's like, yeah, well, you're playing a poker game and everybody else at the table is collaborating except for you. And so they all are going to be able to work against you. But you have the winning hand. We do have the reality, the science. When scientific studies are done, they do show the things that we're saying, not them. And so we do have a winning hand. And sometimes it can feel really hard to win the game anyway. But that always gives me like the little kick in the butt to keep going because it's true.
I love that. I'll remember that. And I'm a big fan of Gary Taubes. So um I'll be remembering that when, so, there's just some days where you're like, oh, I
Oh,
can't.
oh,
It's just too much. But yeah, we are really appreciative of the work you're doing and the options that you're giving people. And people are just getting more and more educated. They care so much about their little furry friends and their animals and want the best for them. So we appreciate you coming on and sharing all your knowledge.
sure. My pleasure. Take care.